All right, I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone to this webinar on unlocking the power of advocacy, navigating lobbying laws for nonprofits. This is going to be an exciting webinar. Really looking forward to this and so glad people are continuing to jump on. Okay, my name is Mary Elizakowski and I'm a Coalition Health Director with Foundation for a Healthy North Dakota. We are a nonprofit organization established in 2022 with a mission to promote health and wellness across North Dakota by working at the community level. We are growing a statewide coalition to enable local communities to collaborate and work together on common initiatives. And by becoming a member of the coalition, you will be the first to receive information about educational webinars such as this, updates on relevant public health information, legislative news, as well as access to digital advocacy resources and toolkits. Just some housekeeping things to go over. Webinar attendees are automatically muted for the presentation. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box and our team will be monitoring questions that come in, along with ones that came in during registration. We are recording the presentation and you will receive a recording after it's complete with an evaluation survey as well. It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Jessica Robinson. She is a partner at the law firm Trister, Schadler Gold PLLC. She practices in all areas of political law, advising clients on how to best structure their work to win elections and advance social, economic, and political justice while complying with federal, state, and local campaign finance laws and the Internal Revenue Code. She represents clients ranging from traditional charities to candidates to movement organizations engaged in direct action. Ms. Robinson has successfully represented clients from the Federal Election Commission, the IRS, and various state campaign finance agencies. Before joining Trister Ross, she was an associate general counsel at the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFL-CIO, and previously worked for Congressman Henry Waxman and Senator John Glenn. She received her JD from the Georgetown University Law Center and her BA from the George Washington University and is a native of Fort Gibson, Oklahoma. So welcome. And I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. And I appreciate that all of you are willing to give up your lunch hour to come and listen to me talk about the tax code. So I know that for nonprofit employees and managers, we're no strangers to paperwork. And really the presentation I'm about to give you is how you deal with a lot of your paperwork, like your tax forms and timesheets and lobbying registration and reports. So let's dig into our paperwork. Okay. So for those of you who work for 501c3s, which is primarily what this is geared toward, you know that the 501c3 has to engage only in charitable activities. And for IRS purposes, for tax purposes, for the purpose of your tax exemption, that means charitable, educational, religious. There are some, a few other things like animal protection and safety, but you have to engage only in activities that fall within the IRS's definition of charitable. So we're going to talk about a tiny exception to that, and that is engaging in lobbying as a 501c3 and how 501c3s are limited in engaging in lobbying. And then we'll talk about some advocacy activities that are not lobbying for IRS purposes. And this will help you boost your advocacy and maybe engage in more advocacy than you thought you were able to as a 501c3 we'll look at some real world situations where people have either engaged in lobbying or activities that look like lobbying but really aren't. And as requested, I will give you an overview of both North Dakota's lobbying laws and South Dakota's lobbying laws. So we're going to cover all of the Dakotas. So
Did you want to?
501c3.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. Did you want to share your screen?
Oh, I did. Yeah, thank you. Sorry. I that would be helpful to everyone. Let's see. I don't have the little share your screen yet. There it is. Okay, found it. And which of my many screens? That one. All right. Okay, so 501c3s can engage in lobbying. They are limited in the amount of lobbying that they can engage in, and they often receive restricted grants, either from other 501c3s that are public charities or from private foundations that prohibit them from using those restricted grants for lobbying activities. Now, public charities, again, can use some of their funds to engage in lobbying. Private foundations are not allowed to directly pay for lobbying. They can't earmark their funds for lobbying. And so typically they will say you can't lobby with them if they give a charity a grant. And there are some little rules to engage in advocacy programs that may look like you're using private foundation funds for lobbying, but you really aren't. And everybody sort of, the IRS understands that, the private foundations understand that. It's magic math. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so how much lobbying can a 501c3 engage in? Well, the tax code says that no substantial part of what a charity does can be engaging in propaganda or promotion of legislation, what we call lobbying. Now, many large charities use a test to measure their lobbying called the no substantial part test. It's not very clear. It's pretty imprecise. And it means that, well, we think that it means only about 5% of their activity in a year can be IRS-defined lobbying. Other smaller organizations are smart and they fill out a little piece of paper that takes less than 1 minute to complete and drop it in the mail to the IRS. And that allows them to use the expenditure test, sometimes known as the 501H test. It has very clear definitions of lobbying. They're narrower than lobbying under the no substantial part test. And the IRS gives you the math and tells you exactly how much your organization can spend on lobbying each year. It's a percentage of the overall funds that you spend on your charitable activity, all the way up to $1 million. So it'll never be more than $1 million in a year, but you won't hit that till you're spending $17 million in a year. And typically we would say, oh, if you're spending $25 million or less than a year, just go ahead and take the expenditure, take the 501H exemption and use the expenditure test because it's easier for you. It's easier for your private foundation donors. And it's not necessary to put yourself through the hassle of using the no substantial part test. Okay, so we are focusing on the IRS's definition of lobbying and the IRS's rules for lobbying. There are many different definitions of lobbying in this country. Congress, when you lobby Congress and the federal executive branch, there's a separate definition of lobbying for registering and reporting as a lobbyist with Congress, okay? There is a different definition of lobbying in every state. Many counties cities, other municipalities have their own lobbying registration and reporting laws. But because we're focusing on 501c3s and maintaining your tax exemption and maximizing your opportunities to engage in advocacy, what we're going to focus on is the IRS's definition and the rules that apply to that definition. But we will discuss North Dakota and South Dakota registration and reporting at the end. Now, under the tax code, there are two types of lobbying. And really, again, we're going to talk about the expenditure test because that's where the definitions really come in. There is direct lobbying, which is a communication with a lawmaker or a legislative employee that can take action with respect to legislation. It also applies to members of the executive branch that can take action on legislation. So that might be if the governor or a mayor can veto legislation. But generally, other types of executive branch lobbying are not lobbying under the tax code. So if you're lobbying on state regulations or HHS regulations at the federal level, that is not lobbying for tax purposes. So that is not something that you have to track for reporting on your Form 990 that you file with the IRS every year. The other type of lobbying is grassroots lobbying, okay? So this is a communication to the public to influence lawmakers. Okay, so there are three elements to direct lobbying. Communication that it's directly with the legislator or staff. It must be about specific legislation or legislative policy proposal. General discussions about public policy, Congress needs to fix climate change, that is not specific legislation. And then the last one is it has to reflect the organization's view on that legislation, okay? So if you send a sign-on letter to several members of Congress or members of the state legislature that say, we need increased funding for maternal health care, and please vote on, HR 512. That is specific legislation, reflects the organization's view on it, and you sent it to the legislators. As I said, general policy discussion is not a specific legislation or legislative proposal. Regulatory and executive actions, not legislative policy proposals. School board decisions, corporate or institutional actions, but they do include changes to existing law. So if you're asking the state legislature to increase the budget on this or tweak an existing statute on that, that is a specific legislative policy proposal. One thing we sometimes see is something that's not a specific legislative policy proposal in a particular place, but they say to the legislators, an organization may say, oh, Delaware has passed this law and it does X, Y, and Z. We would like you to do that here. That is a specific legislative policy proposal, even if it's not been introduced in your state. So here's an example of direct lobbying. Advocates go in, they lobby for a specific legislative program to be adopted by the state legislature, and here's the result. They send out the legislature sends out a tweet about it. So there's your direct lobbying. One note that I want to make is that ballot measure communications are direct lobbying, okay? Under the tax code, for state law purposes, they're campaign finance expenditures that are dealt with under a different reporting regime. But for tax law purposes, ballot measure communications are direct lobbying because in this case, the public is the legislature. So if you're communicating with the public and taking about a specific ballot measure, and the organization is taking a position on it, you have engaged in lobbying. Okay, so grassroots lobbying. There are 4 elements to grassroots lobbying. It is a communication to the public on specific legislation. And again, it will reflect the organization's view on the legislation, but it includes a call to action. So this is typically, contact your city council member, contact your state legislator. The call to action is the difference between engaging in direct lobbying or grassroots lobbying. Now, a call to action can be, contact your legislator. It could be identifying the recipient of the communication, identifying their legislative representative, providing a legislator's contact information, portraying them as neutral or opposed to the organization's position on the bill, or providing some vehicle for them to contact the legislator. Sometimes you might get a phone call that allows you to press a button and be passed through to your legislator's office. You may get an email form or a petition to sign that's going to be delivered to the legislator. Those are all calls to action. Okay. But if it doesn't have that call to action, even if it is a communication to the public that takes a position on the organization's, that presents the organization's position on a specific legislative issue, if that call to action is missing, it is not lobbying, okay? So here we have an op-ed in the Baltimore Sun talking about this, how the city council should pass the Baltimore City Healthy Kids Meal Bill, but it doesn't ask anyone in the public to contact the city council about that. So it is not lobbying, and it doesn't have to be counted toward your lobbying cap. One thing that you should keep in mind is that lobbying includes these communications and your preparatory or background work for those communications. So if you're using the expenditure test, you have to make sure you keep track of staff time, not only for making the communications, but for things that go into that are used to prepare for those communications. Activities whose only purpose is to prepare for lobbying must be paid for with lobbying dollars tracked and included on your 990 as a lobbying cost. Meetings to set lobbying strategy with your partners, polls that you use just for lobbying, and time spent writing handouts that you only use in lobbying. All right, so we're going to talk about a few things that aren't lobbying and that you can use to really maximize your advocacy activities and maybe use some non-lobbying funds to get your policy objectives enacted. One of these is the subsequent use rule. As long as you are using a non-lobbying communication that is first distributed to the general public, so it's either distributed before you use it in direct lobbying, or it is distributed at the same time, so before or simultaneously, then you can use it in your broader lobbying effort. So you can take it with you to lobby state legislators as long as you've distributed it broadly to the public. That could mean, sending it out to the press with a link to the document, putting it on your website. If you have, distributing it to allied organizations. Making sure that you get it out to plenty of people in the public. Then you can take that document with you and distribute it to legislators and their staff at the Capitol. And the cost of creating those materials and the time spent doing that will not be treated as a lobbying cost. So this applies not only to sort of large policy documents, but fact sheets and op-eds and other things that don't include a call to action. And here's an example of that. Here is here's some material that was distributed saying that Congress should end the sale of flavored tobacco products, okay? It's distributed broadly. It, I think, might have been published in either a newspaper or some magazines. Here is the statement at the end, right? It doesn't tell anyone to contact their member of Congress. It just says, Congress do this, but it's distributed to the public and not to a member of Congress. And so once that's been distributed to the public, you can take this up to the Capitol and hand it to your members of Congress, as was done here. And the costs of those materials are not, don't have to be paid for with lobbying dollars. Next is a nonpartisan analysis, study, and research. Lots of organizations actually do this, but they don't realize that it's not lobbying, okay? So they put together these, or they, take a deep dive into some policy proposals, and they do some analysis of it. It has to be independent and objective so that someone on either side could come to their own conclusion about it. You're allowed to advocate a viewpoint as long as the exposition of the issues is full and fair. And it doesn't include a call to action in it. In that case, you can take this research up again, even if it's not distributed to the public, you can distribute it to your legislators. And the cost of doing that, which can sometimes be expensive if you're doing real research, including public opinion research. In that case, it is not a lobbying cost. Another thing that isn't lobbying is technical advice or assistance. So the tax code says, look, if a governmental body or a legislative committee or subcommittee, if they ask you to come and provide advice, including an opinion about a piece of legislation, that's okay to do that. You can do that. The IRS won't treat it as lobbying cost, but remember, this has to be done exactly right. It has to come from it has to be made in the name of the committee or subcommittee or the governmental agency, and like the committee chair, not just one member of the committee. And it has to, you have to provide advice that's available to all members of the requesting entity. So it can't just be the majority members of the committee or the minority members of the committee. It has to be available to all members of the entity. And again, you can advocate a viewpoint if the request for technical advice or assistance specifically asks for opinions or recommendations. Okay, and a couple of things that I just want to talk about here, which may be obvious to you, but educating policymakers about what you do, okay, without taking a position on a specific legislation is not lobbying. So you could invite them to come see your facilities where you serve the public, or talk to them about how important public funding is to providing nutritious meals to children in public schools, or how important your work promoting breastfeeding is for the health of newborn infants, etc. And that is not lobbying. Just explanatory discussions of specific legislation, as long as you're not taking a position on it, would not be lobbying. So this probably is lobbying if you're handing it to a member of the legislature because it explains why the legislation is needed. If you are just sending it out to the public and you're taking a position on it, but you don't include the call to action, again, it's not going to be lobbying. So this is just explanatory material that does not include the call to action. Again, just like we said, reports, fact sheets, op-eds, no call to action, not lobbying. Communications that don't refer to specific legislative policy proposals, not lobbying. There are limited ways that 501c3s can engage with candidates for office as opposed to legislators or sitting policymakers. And one of those ways is to educate candidates. It has to be all candidates in a specific race. So if you have 5 people running for state senate in a legislative district, then you need to go and provide them all with the same information. Okay, you can't just give it to some of them. It's possible that some won't accept it or will ignore it, and that's fine, but you have to make that effort to provide the same information to all of the candidates. And of course, there are always the thanks and spanks, right? So if a legislator has voted the way that you hoped they would, you can, send out emails or social media posts that thank them. If they have voted the wrong way, you may spank them by being critical of the vote that they took. Now, when you are doing this and you've never done it before, you want to make sure that you start doing this well in advance of an election, because there are lots of rules about what the IRS thinks might be election related, even if you think it's not. So you should talk to a lawyer who understands the intersection between lobbying and tax law and campaign finance issues. There's lawyers like that in every state. So if you haven't started doing this and you want to do it right now, I would encourage you to wait until after this election cycle and then start doing thanks and spanks regularly. All right. So I guess the one thing that I wanted to point out before we move on to the state issue is that, remember, you are tracking your lobbying costs to make sure that you don't exceed your cap. The best way to do that is for staff to keep their time and note, oh, I worked 7 hours today. I spent 1 hour on lobbying, because you have to add up your lobbying costs to make sure that they don't exceed your cap, and you report those amounts on Schedule C of your 990 every year for the IRS to see and make sure that that you're not exceeding, that you're still a charity, right? That you're not exceeding your contribution or your tax limit or lobbying limit for tax purposes. The other thing that I will say is you may work with other tax-exempt organizations that do not have these restrictions, okay? They don't have lobbying caps. That is 501c4 social welfare organizations. If you work for a C3, you may have an affiliated 501c4 where all of the lobbying happens, because there are no limits on how much a C4 can engage in lobbying. 501c5 agricultural and horticultural organizations and labor unions, there are no lobbying caps. 501c6 trade organizations or trade associations, no lobbying caps. It's really just the C3 that has this limit and is required to calculate for tax purposes the amount of lobbying that they engage in. Okay. So let's just have a brief discussion of state law. This is not comprehensive, but I want to tell you that neither North Dakota nor South Dakota lobbying laws are really that complicated. They are pretty easy, and there's really not much more I need to tell you than what I'm going to tell you. You know, if you're from a state like New York or California, it's extremely complicated, and feels like you need to talk to a lawyer just to talk about the government. North Dakota and South Dakota are not that way, okay? North Dakota does not regulate grassroots lobbying. It only regulates direct lobbying. They do not require a lobbying client, so that might be the advocacy organization. Doesn't require the client to register, but individual lobbyists do have to register and file reports in North Dakota. There is a little bit there's a fairly new law that says, oh, if you engage in some administrative action lobbying about regulations, you may have to, as a client, file reports disclosing your source of funds that you raised and used for this administrative action lobbying. Kind of new, and I will say, frankly, surprising for North Dakota to have something that makes you disclose anything. Okay, who's a lobbyist under North Dakota law? Well, it's any person who, in any manner whatsoever, directly or indirectly, very broad, attempts to secure the passage, amendment, or defeat of any legislation by the Legislative Assembly or the approval or veto of any legislation by the governor. So legislative lobbying. And then attempts to influence decisions made by the legislative management or by an interim committee of the legislative management. So it's really just legislative lobbying. Again, there's a disclosure provision that relates to administrative lobbying, but it doesn't trigger registration as a lobbyist if you're lobbying on administrative rules or actions. It doesn't include a private citizen who's lobbying on their own behalf. Or this is sort of our technical advice exception for North Dakota lobbying. If you get asked by the chairman of legislative management or an interim committee of the legislative management or a standing committee of the legislature to come and provide information, you're not going to be required to register as a lobbyist. Or an individual who appears before a legislative committee to present testimony on behalf of a trade or professional organization or a business or industry, but only if you're introduced to the committee by that organization's lobbyist. When do you have to register as a lobbyist in North Dakota? Well, before you lobby. And your registration expires annually on June 30th, so you would have to re-register every year if you continue to lobby. To register as a lobbyist in North Dakota, it's pretty simple. There's an online site called the First Stop Portal. It's on the Secretary of State's website, where the lobbyist will go in, set up an account, and you just give your name and address, the name of your clients or those who are paying you to lobby, the duration of your lobbying engagement with those clients, and then you pay a fee, $25 for the first clients, $15 for each subsequent client. And then after that, the client has to submit a lobbyist authorization through the same portal before you can begin lobbying on the client's behalf. Okay, who files lobbying reports? Super easy. It's the lobbyist only. The client doesn't have to file reports. There's only one annual report. You know, you are not New York. You don't have to file reports every 2 weeks for 6 months and then every month after that. Very easy. They're due by August 1, covering the previous year ending June 30th. They're filed electronically. And this may be the easiest single report I've ever seen. You only report expenditures that are spent for the benefit of a legislator or the governor or their family, okay? That is really the only thing that you're reporting. as lobbying expenditures in North Dakota. You have to provide a description of it along with the date and the amount of the expenditure and the name of the recipient. But I could see how you could do a lot of lobbying without having to report any expenditures on your report. All right, so this is the other little new reporting requirement. You have to report spending on state government action. So promoting or opposing the adoption of a rule by a state agency or the Ethics Commission. So each lobbyist or other person who spends more than $200 for that purpose has to file a report to disclose the ultimate and true source of funds for the expenditure. Okay, what is the ultimate and true source of funds? That is any person that contributed over $200 solely to lobby or influence the state government action. So if you have an affiliate or a donor who gives you $500 for this purpose, then you'd have to disclose them on this report. And again, it's reported through the First Stop portal. Non-lobbyists who do it because they're not registered. So this might be a client that has to report this information. They can complete it on the portal, but you have to print it out and mail it to the Secretary of State's office or email it. Lobbyists have to wear name badges. So once you register, you'll receive a distinctive lobbyist identification badge, and you have to wear it when you're engaged in lobbying at the Capitol. And then event invitations for legislators. So if you're holding an event and you invite a legislator to a function that you're sponsoring, either in whole or in part, either by your lobbyist or your organization that's employing the lobbyist, then you have to provide the legislator, if they request, the true or estimated cost of the gratuity, so their share of the event, if it's a meal or drinks or whatever, and allow the legislator to pay their own share of those expenses so that you're not reporting that you gave them an expenditure on your reports. And the same with gifts. So if you're going to give a gift to a legislator, you have to give them the true or estimated cost of it and then allow them to pay the cost of the gift. So that's super easy. South Dakota lobbying, a little bit more complicated, but only because in addition to direct lobbying, they also regulate grassroots lobbying. So you have to keep track of your expenditures on grassroots lobbying. Again, the only person who registers as a lobbyist in South Dakota is the individual lobbyist and not the client or employing organization. But South Dakota makes both the lobbyist and the client file an annual report. So what's a lobbyist in South Dakota? Any person employed to seek the introduction of legislation or to promote, oppose, or influence in any manner the passage by the legislature of any legislation affecting the special interests of any agency, individual, association, or business, as distinct from those of the whole people of the state, or to act in any manner as a lobbyist in connection with any such legislation. Okay, so again, this is really legislative lobbying. It's not executive branch lobbying. And it includes both, talking to legislators, direct lobbying, and then organizing constituents to call legislators. So if you're paid to prepare mailers that go out to constituents, asking them to contact their state legislators, you are a paid lobbyist in South Dakota. If you're paid to make phone calls or etc., you have to register as a lobbyist. When do you register as a lobbyist? Same as in North Dakota, before engaging in lobbying. And there is electronic registration. Secretary of State's website has a lobbying section, and you'll go there, register, provide the lobbyists information, the length of the time that they'll be employed to lobby by their client, and the subject matter that they are lobbying on. The costs are a little bit steeper in South Dakota to be a lobbyist, $40 as opposed to $25 or $15. Is any action required by the client? Yes. So Once the lobbyist registers, then the client has to follow up with an employer authorization form that's signed and then send it in so the state knows that they are, in fact, the lobbyist is, in fact, authorized to lobby by that client. Both the lobbyist and the client file reports. They're only annual reports, but they're due by July 1st in South Dakota, which if you're registered in both states, that then gives you an extra month to go prepare your North Dakota reports because they're due August 1st. And you just email them or you can report them through the electronic reporting system. So what are you disclosing on these lobbying reports? Well, they're a little slightly more detailed than North Dakota. You have to provide complete and detailed report of all costs incurred for the purpose of influencing legislation, with the date, amount, and purpose of each expenditure. This includes costs for your grassroots lobbying activities. But you don't have to include the personal expenses of the lobbyists for their own meals and travel and lodging. And the client does not have to report the compensation that they pay to the lobbyist. So when the client files reports, it reports its own expenditures on its report. For example, it's very likely that the client would pay for its own grassroots lobbying communications, that the lobbyist isn't going to be the one who pays for those. So the client would report that. And then the lobbyist reports their own expenditures. There may be times where the lobbyist has no expenditures to report because the client is reimbursing them for all of their lobbying expenses. And lobbyists also have to wear name badges in South Dakota. The Secretary of State supplies the badge, and you have to wear it when you're engaged in lobbying in the Capitol complex. Something that you should know is there are sometimes crossovers between lobbying and campaign finance law. Under South Dakota's campaign finance laws, there is a type of communication called an independent communication expenditure, and it requires reporting when you make a public communication that concerns a candidate. We don't really know what that means, except for we think that it means if your ad refers to a candidate, and often candidates are city legislators. So if you're going to refer to a candidate in your grassroots lobbying communication or your public education communication, you should know that you may be required to file this specific type of campaign finance report. And believe it or not, South Dakota does outlaw bribery. Most places do. This just happened to be a note that was in my files, and I thought, I'm just going to throw it in there, that you can't give gifts to influence a legislator to do something, or refrain from doing something, or to try to influence the actions of the legislature in any way. I think you all know that. Just a reminder that they're crossover with some criminal laws as well. Okay, I can't believe we got through it all. Happy to answer
Awesome.
questions.
Yes, I'm just gonna put my screen up and then we can move into some of the questions if that's okay.
Yeah.
Wow, so much information. This was great. Okay, I do see some questions that have come in, and we have some that came in also during registration. And just thanks everyone who attended the presentation. There is a QR code you can scan and take the survey while we move into questions. And so I see the first one here is, can you provide the list again of the entities that don't have lobbying limits?
Yes. The list that do not have lobbying limits is everything but a C3. So if you have a title holding corporation, a C2, no lobbying limits. well, actually, let's leave that one aside because I think it can't do any lobbying. Never mind. Okay, so C2, we're going to set that aside. C4, C5, C6, those are really the common advocacy organizations that you'll find that are engaged in lobbying or other advocacy work. And they do not have lobbying limits because contributions to them are not deductible for income tax purposes, like contributions to C3s are.
Okay. And then would a 501c6 also need to do the gratuity disclosure?
So yes, so any entity that engages in lobbying, whether it's a for-profit, a nonprofit, a C3, a C6, what have you, they have to disclose that information about the gratuity if asked by the legislator, because the legislator is passing the laws and they want to make sure they give themselves an opportunity to avoid you having to disclose that they have received a gratuity or gift from you.
Wonderful. And another one, can you please speak to the 501c3 that receive federal funds and their ability to advocate versus lobby?
Okay, so 501c3s that receive federal funds can engage in lobbying. They can also engage in advocacy. Advocacy or lobbying is a type of advocacy. What you need to be aware of is that the federal funds cannot be used for lobbying. If you have another source of funds that can be used for lobbying, something from another public charity, something from ordinary individual donors, as long as the donor doesn't say you can't use these funds for lobbying, then you can use those funds for lobbying. Okay, if you have a general support grant, you can use those funds for lobbying. You just cannot use the federal funds for lobbying. So what I recommend is that organizations that receive federal funds, usually you have to, depending on the agency that they come from, you may have to put them in a separate bank account. If the agency doesn't require that, I typically advise people that, if you are an organization that is going to engage in lobbying, make sure you put your federal funds into a separate bank account so that you can demonstrate that you never used any of those funds for lobbying.
Okay, thank you. And another one, can you expand a little more on the North Dakota Administrative Action Lobbying? Does that include submitting comments on proposed changes to administrative rules?
Yes, it does. There actually may be I'm going to say tentatively, yes, it does. But if you will email me your question, I will look it up and answer it for you. There may be an exception for organizations that provide comments through the public notice and comment procedure under the State Administrative Procedures Act. Sometimes that is an exception to this. So I will look that up for you if you will email me your question, and I'm going to put my email here in the chat.
Sounds good. And I can also connect you. But yes, we can give your email out too. Okay, next. So these are the ones that came in through registration. What kind of policies do you recommend for nonprofits regarding lobbying, and how should they educate staff on what lobbying is? And then another, do you possibly have a lobbying policy for nonprofits? So a little similar. So
yeah, so I don't have a model policy for lobbying, and I will tell you why. It is because organizations take widely different approaches to lobbying. There are some C3s that just don't engage in any lobbying at all, okay? For those that do, and they know that they're going to be close to the line, typically what they do is they will assign very specific staff to engage in the lobbying activity so that they know that it's going to be tracked and no one else will inadvertently engage in lobbying. All staff fill out the timesheets. Everybody tracks their time so they know if there is going to be anyone else who engages in lobbying. They calculate those at least once a month so they can see where they are on their expenditure test. And they will work to maximize, once they get close, they're going to work to maximize their non-lobbying advocacy activities. There are places where you have to, some organizations say, look, if you're going to interact with a legislator or a policymaker that's in the government, you have to come and seek permission before you do that. And we have to figure out whether it's going to be lobbying or if it's not going to be lobbying, because they really need to know that for the purposes of the cap. And also sometimes for their foundation donors. And I meant to touch on this a little bit earlier. There is what is called a project support grant that foundations that can't pay for lobbying will make to public charities. And, the public charity will submit a proposal that includes all this advocacy activity. And then you get a grant agreement back that says, we would love for you to engage in all that advocacy activity, but you can't use any of this for lobbying. And so you submit a budget to them and it has, 20% of your project is lobbying. They can give up to the non-lobbying amount, and you have to show that you have other sources of funds that are used, that can be used for the lobbying part of it. Now, you may have showed another donor that you had this incoming grant from this foundation that you were using for the lobbying, and you weren't going to use their funds for lobbying. It's okay for everybody, all right? As long as for each of those foundations, you can demonstrate that you have funds that aren't theirs that can be used for lobbying. And it doesn't actually matter whose funds you used, as long as you can sign the grant agreement. And the IRS knows this. They know that it's a little funny math. Most of the foundations understand this rule, and that's really what they are asking you to do. So I guess what I'm saying is you need to keep track of your lobbying and make sure you know who's doing it so that you don't run into surprises. And the way that there are lots of opportunities to educate staff about what lobbying is. And you need to do not just the tax end of it, but if they're engaged in federal lobbying, you need to understand what the rules are for that and what the rules are in your state. There are nonprofits that do a lot of this educational work. The Alliance for Justice is a good one that has lots of state level material about lobbying and lots of federal level material about lobbying. And sometimes you can actually get them to come and do a presentation for your staff or a group of other organizations in the state. They do a lot in California. I'm not sure how much they do in other states, but they have lots of materials on just about every state.
Thank you for that information. I see one more. And is any of this applicable to 501c5 agricultural organizations, such as a farmer's market with a nonprofit volunteer board?
No, except for the state lobbying law. Okay, so the federal tax law discussion that we had, I guess it's nice to know what is lobbying, but you don't have any caps. You may be required, if you have membership entities that pay dues to you, you should either tell them that their payments are not tax deductible, or you need to report to them what share of your activities is lobbying so that they know that they can't deduct the lobbying share of their dues that they pay to you.
Okay.
But the state lobbying law does apply to everybody.
Okay. Awesome. Great questions. Thank you everyone for submitting those. I don't see any other ones. Awesome.
All right.
Well, thank you, Jessica, for taking the time and putting this wonderful educational presentation together. This was just such great information. And to all who could attend, and to stay connected with us, you can follow us on Healthy NODAC on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Foundation for Healthy North Dakota on LinkedIn. And to join our coalition, visit our link to stay aware of future webinars and updates on the foundation. And there's another chance to scan the QR code to take the evaluation survey. Thanks again. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day. And yeah, I'm just so glad so many people could attend and learn all this great information. So thanks again, Jessica.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions, everybody.